Welcome to the Fortean Winds podcast, where we talk about UFOs and all the related high strangeness. I'm Bones, and with us as always is RamX.
Hey, everybody.
Hey, Ram. So in this episode, we go deep into the strange continuity between Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth and the modern UAP encounters we have discussed and cataloged. Now, Robert Kirk, we're talking about his work in the late 1600s, and we are doing the fairy episode finally. And this is just is not a simple folklore comparison either. What emerges is a patterned phenomenon, a liminal intelligence playing out through multiple cultural lenses. So by drawing explicit connections between Kirk's 17th century account of fairies and the 21st century documentation of UAP events, we make the case for a single continuity. Non-human intelligences engaging in humans via myth, psychology, and perception. The pattern has persisted, and both Kirk and modern research offer the keys to understanding it. So we're finally doing this, right, Ram?
Yeah, we can finally stop doom scrolling and talk about the the lights in the sky.
Right.
Speaking of lights in the sky, that's exactly what we tend to think about when we think of fairies. We think of Tinkerbell, we think of the fairy godmother, we think of witches in forests, and that's not really accurate to what fairies are. First of all, fairies is a grossly blanket term, which encompasses a number of religious traditions, which were all native to Europe prior to Rome coming in, and then the church expanding into Rome, and then Rome turning everyone Christian.
Right.
That's kind of when the term fairy started to envelop all of this stuff. But what we're going to focus on is Robert Kirk's work. So the reason why we would be talking about Robert Kirk's work will become apparent when I tell you the full title of his book, which is The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns, and Fairies, or The Nature and Actions of the Subterranean, and for the most part, invisible people, heretofore going under the name of elves, fauns, and fairies.
Okay.
So he mentions both invisible and subterranean, which are two categories which we have determined this current phenomenon could fit into.
Okay.
So right in the title, we see the first parallel between our work and Robert Kirk's work. And that's what becomes really interesting here, is that he's writing this back in 1691.
Right.
And at that time, Robert Kirk is a minister in the Anglican or Episcopal Church, and he's ministering all over the Scottish Highlands. And he takes up the task of being the first Fortean. And he goes around to people in his own flock, as well as visiting other towns and collecting stories of people who encountered what they were calling fairies. And in Scotland, they were more likely to be called Sith. In Ireland, they were more likely to be called the Sidhe. In Iceland, it was the Huldul folk. And then in Denmark, it was the Elver folk, which is likely where the word elf comes from, or elven.
Yeah.
And then there's the Alfar of Norse legend. And then there's the Teg of Wales. So there are legends that are pretty much identical to the ones that Robert Kirk discovered in all of these different cultures. And then there's identical legends in many other cultures. There are the Kitsune from Japan. There are the Jinn of the Middle East, which I think we'll discuss in our next episode. And we'll go into a few more of these other cultures that have the same exact legends. But Kirk's work is the best on the subject because he went around and did the Fortean process of going, okay, I'm going to collect different stories and I'm going to look for patterns, and then I'm going to develop theories based off of the patterns. And what's amazing is what his theories were, and then what we're discovering today about UAP. So if we focus more on Scotland, where Kirk was doing his work, we find the fairy folk often referred to as the good people. And they were referring to them as the good people in order to not tick them off. They thought it was actually going to curry favor with them because they were afraid of them. But that's a good way to tell you they weren't cute. They weren't fun. These were scary beings.
Right. These weren't little Tinkerbells flying around.
But what I think would be most interesting is to look at the book and then draw a direct comparison between things we've discussed on the show and the exact thing that Kirk is talking about in the book, because I think it's really striking. So let's start with Kirk's basic description. And I'm reading from a copy that's actually for free right now on Kindle on Amazon. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat here. Highly recommend this book. It's pretty short. You can get through it, but it is a little difficult to read because it's written in an older English style. So I'm going to start by reading you the literal text, and then I'm going to start paraphrasing it, and I think you'll see why when I read you the literal.
Okay, great.
These Siths, or fairies, they call Slay Maith, or the good people. It would seem to prevent the dint of their ill attempt for the Irish use to bless all they fear harm of, and are said to be of a middle nature betwixt man and angel, as were daemons thought to be of old, of intelligent studious spirits, and light-changeable bodies, like those called astral. So now I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit, and what he's saying is that they referred to them as the good people in order to not piss them off. And he said the Irish have a habit of blessing the things that they fear.
Interesting.
And he said that these beings are between a man and an angel. So there's something in between, which is very interesting because when we come to the jinn, you'll see that there's sit exactly there in the cosmology, even in the Quran.
Right, right.
He references daemons, and daemon spelling is Daemons. And this is from the Greek, daemon, which is meant to be a spirit that is not tied to a other entity. So in Greece, there was daemons, which were kind of like free spirits or free agents. And then there were angelus or angelus, which were ended up being angels, but those were messengers from the gods, like Hermes.
Okay, yeah.
Angelus. So those words end up getting incorporated, and those concept ends up getting incorporated into the Hebrew Bible, where angels and demons. But in ancient Greek folklore, the daemon was more of a free agent.
Okay, right.
And that's really relevant here because that's what the fairies kind of are. The interactions have very different patterns. So they have malevolent ones. And for example, people would refer to a helpful spirit in their house as a brownie. And this was something that might help you out and make hot water in the morning or something like that. And they referred to a similar negative spirit who was turning things over and stealing things and making things turn bad as a boggart. And depending on how you treated a brownie, you could potentially turn it into a boggart if you were to disrespect it or offend it. So there was a lot of superstition around how to interact with these invisible beings. In chapter 1, he describes them as subterranean inhabitants. And he says these Siths, or fairies, have light-changeable bodies like the nature of a cloud, and that they're somewhat ethereal, and they're not physical like us, but they can be seen. And then what comes up a lot in this book is what he refers to as the second sight, which is a ESP, or psychic ability, or remote viewing, or mediumship. That's what we would call it all today.
Right.
But what Kirk refers to as the second sight. And he considers this second sight and the fairies to be super interrelated. So it's only people with second sight who are able to see the fairies. And there are a lot of cases where people who are contactees or abductees or mediums have the same issue, where they can see things in the room that other people can't. And if you had multiple of them in the same room, they would all be seeing the same thing, but the other people can't. And then this prevents us from fully understanding it or accepting that those invisible things to us are actually there. So when Kirk describes many of these beings, he's describing what a witness who has second sight told him, the same way someone might record what a medium or abductee or contactee told him. And Kirk goes out of his way to point out that this second sight should not be considered witchcraft. It's as natural as someone having brown eyes or black hair. And he points out that it's often conflated with witchcraft and perceived as demonic or satanic, but it shouldn't be in Kirk's eyes. And this is interesting because Kirk is an Anglican preacher. He's not a Catholic preacher. So he's not subject to the same Catholic dogma or the same Catholic governance, because I think work like this would not get out. I'm sure that Catholic priests went out and interviewed people and did extensive work on the unknown and the supernatural that we're never going to see. That's buried in the Vatican Library.
Right. It was discussed in the Vatican, and that's it.
That's it.
Yeah.
And we know that for sure. I think Diana Pasulka has mentioned that.
Mm-hmm.
Kirk created the most detailed ethnographic account we have of people who claimed direct interaction with fairies. And this was not metaphor or myth. They were described as encounters, the same way people are taking in witness encounters today from paranormal or UFO abductions. And speaking of abductions, there's lots of stories of abductions in Kirk's work. There's a lot of talk about children being abducted and then doppelgangers put in their place. And they would say this was something to do with the child's behavior would change, maybe a baby's behavior would change, and they would say, oh, then he was swapped out for a fairy. A lot of that ends up sounding like it was complete disinformation and misinformation on these people's part. It sounds like a complete misunderstanding of medical science and what happened. So they just assumed everything was fairy. Oh, someone was abducted and replaced with the fairy.
Right.
So these cases of doppelgangers come up in Kirk's work, and some of them might be supported. Who knows? I wasn't there to interview the witnesses, but they're not the most interesting part to me. The most interesting part are the parts where he's talking about beings who abducted people, and it sounds very much like an alien encounter.
Right.
Or entities who live underground and only appear at twilight. And this comes up a lot. Kirk brings up the whole idea of these things living in a liminal state, in between here and there, betwixt places. So he didn't have the verbal words to call something interdimensional. Right. And let me give you a good example of that. So my favorite story was this guy who was wrestling a fairy in Kirk's work. And his neighbors said that he was wrestling with the fairy on one hill, and then he would pop up on another hill, and they'd be wrestling again over on the other hill. And then he'd pop up in another location, and that would be there. And they believed he was going in and out of fairyland.
Oh, right.
And in my head, that all looks like a cartoon where the guy's on top and then there's a little elf on top of him across the hill and smashing his chair over his head or something. Yeah. But what they were describing was someone moving in and out of dimensions, moving in and out of space and time. So that's really interesting. And they had no words for that.
Right. I mean, one of the amazing things about Kirk's work is the fact of how well he described it. For his time. I mean, we're talking, pre-electricity. They just don't have any references, modern references. That reminds me of, how the Quran describes the jinn as like smokeless fire. They see some kind of ambient light or whatever it is, and they can only reference what they know. And so for them, it was smokeless fire.
Yeah, I think that ties to what they believe the jinn's origin story was. I think man was made of clay, like celestial beings were made of light, and then jinn were made of smokeless fire, which sounds a lot like plasma, or it could be electricity. People have wondered, and that's interesting too. And those things come up here too. So this is just a reframing of the same intelligence in my mind. It's interacting with us the same way. It limits our worldview. In Kirk's day, that was angel and demon binaries, and it was kind of turning that on its head with fairies. But we can't exclude what was going on with the culture at the same time, because these old gods and these old ways were moving out of the culture, and the Christianity was moving in. And as Christianity moved in, it saw all of this stuff as demonic or witchcraft, and that was it. But yet these different patterns never stopped. And then they clearly didn't have technology back then. So this second sight was everything. They couldn't rely on EMF meters, and they didn't expect to. So they and the psychics were accepted at that time. People had visions. People had predictive visions that came true, and then they were known throughout the land.
Not only second sight, you got to think, I put a lot of credit into people's awareness back then of their surroundings, because you think pre-electricity, people used to, it was very common for people to, they retire and go to bed at a much earlier time at sundown. And then it was common for them to wake up and have like a wake up time in the middle of the night. And not only that, I mean, their night vision is probably so much better than ours in our modern times, where we're just staring at light sources constantly.
Yeah, a big part of this is a knowledge of the natural world. Kirk thought these beings were natural. He did not think that they were supernatural per se. He thought they were a natural part of God's world.
Right, right.
And this second sight seemed like a very natural part of their world as well. And Kirk writes in his book that Highlanders, yet far more Islanders, were qualified with this second sight. He thought people from the Isles were more likely to have second sight. That men, women, and children indistinctly were subject to it, and children where parents were not. Sometimes people came to age who had it not when young, nor could any tell by what means produced. So he's saying that it's usually inherited, but not always. Sometimes kids start to have it for no reason. And he's saying sometimes when people come to a certain age, they just have second sight. It is a trouble to most of them who are subject to it, and they would be rid of it at any rate if they could. I mean, we've had mediums on this show tell us that. I remember Lucinda saying that. She said, hey, if you want this, you could have it. You do not want to see an alien. So
Right.
A lot of people who have this type of mediumship ability would rather not have it. And I think that that's a very consistent theme. They can't turn it on and off always, and it gets in the way of their life. They can't interact with people about it without them thinking they're crazy.
Right.
And Kirk went on a lot about the seventh son, because he thought that the seventh son was the most likely to have this gift. And back then it was pretty common for people to have 7 kids, so it was much more common to be a seventh son.
Right.
But he also points out that some are gifted from birth and others are cursed into it by trauma or lineage. And he mentions trauma, which is pretty interesting because that's something that we found. I mean, even like the Chris Bledsoe story involves trauma, and then he starts seeing it. Lots of it. So the tech didn't just get better. We just changed how we tuned to the second sight. I mean, if you want to look at it that way, radar is a second sight. FLIR is a second sight. But the principles are the same. Like, these beings choose how and when they are seen. We are not observers. We are participants in their stage presentation. Kirk notes that just like UAP, these fairies seem to only be visible from certain angles or at certain times, like he notes twilight or liminal hours. He keeps talking about liminal spaces, which we've noted is a state of change. And if they're in between this place and another one, well, it seems like that's when the door is the weakest.
Right.
And that brings us into like the trickster pattern, which is like glamour, misdirection, and how it deals with us. This big psyop. So yeah, Kirk describes the glamour, the phantasmic projections used by fairies to confuse perception. He says they cast up mists, they vanish into lights, or assume familiar forms. And he says their ends are obscure, but their intentions are deliberate.
So the glamour is the operating system. It's how it runs. It's not malfunctioning. It's like it's performing, just like every UAP report with a contradictory shape, or like impossible physics. It's it's shifting around, but its shifting behavior is functioning correctly. The goal isn't like to contact humans. It's to to create this myth It's a myth generation, and of course confusion, fragmentation of memory. And they don't really need secrecy laws. They just need us questioning our senses. It's exactly like UAP.
Yeah, the real cage ends up being ontological. It's what we consider real, and they stay on the edge of what's real. And so Kirk notes that, and it's through trust in people who have this second sight, and through taking reports from different ones and looking at patterns in between them. And you can see Kirk do that in his work and some of his objectivity that he shows, and how he looks for evidence and how he looks for people who wouldn't have known each other saying the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, his perception on the whole topic is just phenomenal when you think about the date, when you think it was the late 1600s. It's amazing.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about how perception may be shaped by quantum interference, and UAPs often change form in mid-sighting, from orb to triangle, or from metallic to plasma. In multiple Fortean Winds posts, we have the craft or entities are described as shape-shifting, responsive, and theatrical.
Right. And like we said, we've made the point so many times is that if they wanted to be fully seen and discovered, they would do it.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of what Keel called it, the psychic circus. And he knew very well that this fairy stuff was connected. And that reminds me of a moment in the Mothman case that came up that is very fairy-like. And a witness reported a UFO landed in the road, and a being got out, and it was the Grinning Man. And his name was Indrid Cold, which is a very fairy-like name, and Keel, I think, noted that. And he had these big, huge, sharp teeth, and he kept grinning, which is also sounding very fairy-like. And then Cold asks the man, well, what is that glowing in the distance over there? That's the city where people are living. And he says, oh, we have a place like that. It's called a gathering.
Oh, okay.
That sounds very fairy-like, too. And this is in the middle of the Mothman incident, which, had a creature that looked like folklore as well. And then also had lots and lots of UFOs, more UFO sightings during the Mothman incident than anything else.
Right.
So both Keel and Valet have noted that fairy connection heavily in their work. Valet's Passport to Magonia. Magonia is fairyland.
Yep. One thing that stuck out with me is how Kirk described the fairy dwellings as under hills, accessible only at certain times or through invisible doors. The structures would vanish when approached without permission, so they were real but conditional.
Yeah, that connection to the underground is fascinating to me because we found direct connections between underground and UAP instances in our article on tunnels in Peru. We found tunnels that connected 3 major sites in South American ufology. We found one that connected Colares to Nazca to the site in Peru where there was all those attacks.
Right.
And we've mapped the surface of Earth, but not the subsurface of perception. Fairy hills were our ancestors, labels for liminal geography. Today we call them transmedium domains, or wormholes, or portals, or window areas. The entity always needs a place to disappear into. That space has always been with us. It's just renamed.
Right.
Even the craft are transmedium in today's world. These UAPs are seen entering oceans without a splash, or vanishing into mountains, emerging out of nowhere. These are not conventional bases. They're temporary intersection points. There may be conventional bases somewhere on Earth, which is launching out these transmedium craft, but they've been around a long time. And like the fairy mound, these places exist when the phenomenon wants to.
We can't discuss Robert Kirk without mentioning the fact that he disappeared. It's a big deal in the Kirk story.
His death was the subject of a lot of rumor and myth, which was appropriate for Robert Kirk. His own disappearance echoes the subjects of his book. He supposedly collapsed on a fairy hill and was buried. But soon after, his cousin claimed that Kirk appeared in a vision and said that he was taken. And he gave instructions to him on what to do when he was going to appear at his cousin's christening. And they wanted him to throw a dagger over Kirk's head. And if he did that, then Kirk would be able to escape the ferry realm. But if he
Right.
didn't do it, then Kirk would be trapped there forever. And then allegedly, Kirk appeared at the christening, and then everyone was so surprised that they didn't throw the dagger over his head, and then supposedly he was lost. But
Right.
that second part, like, it's not really well supported.
Right.
In the
It's very mythic.
it's very mythic, but it wasn't like a bunch of reliable witness accounts to that.
Right. But that makes Kirk the first abductee on record, right?
No, Jacob Jacobson. The case of Jacob Jacobson. I've brought this up before. Yeah. So he was abducted by fairies, and it sounds very much like a fairy abduction. And at one point, there was this big alien that seemed to be alien. There was this. At one point, there was this big fairy, sort of overweight, kind of goblin-y sounding creature at the table, sort of barking orders at the others. And he had this big red light that Jacob Jacobson was really focused on. And then Jacob Jacobson thought that he had only been gone for like an hour and had left this fairy place, but he had been gone 3 days. And that one was documented.
Okay.
Kirk also got into their weapons and how they hurt us and then what hurts them. And both the people of the Scottish Highlands and Robert Kirk seemed to think that iron potentially hurt them, and Keel seemed to think that that was true too. Iron is a remarkably ferrous or magnetic substance, so he thought that that might disrupt them. But Kirk said of their weapons that they are most what solid earthly bodies. They are much made of stone, like to yellow soft flint. They're shaped like a barbed arrowhead, but flung like a dart, with great force. These arms, cut by art and tools that seem beyond human, have somewhat of the nature of a thunderbolt, subtly and mortally wounding the vital parts, without breaking the skin. So I find that to sound very much like people being irradiated, and this is exactly what we can find in UAP cases. We found the one where the guy shines the flashlight. This was one I think we talked about before that OSWAP recorded. And this guy walks out in his backyard and he shines a flashlight at the UAP, and it shines a light back at him. And he wakes up later and realizes he's burning, and he goes to the hospital and realizes he was irradiated. And we can find other instances of that where without breaking the skin, they seem to be able to apply a very specific beam and a specific type of harm.
Wow. Yeah, that's a good catch. That's a good one.
And here's a good example of Kirk using his discernment and investigative skills. He talks about a seer, which he puts a lot of faith into, as we mentioned in the second sight. And he says, another example is a seer in Scotland, sitting at a table with diverse others. Suddenly he cast his head aside, and the company was asking him why he did it. He answered that a friend of his in Ireland had threatened to cash a dish full of butter in his face. And the men wrote down the day and the hour and sent it off to the gentleman in Ireland and asked him if he said that. And he said, yes, he did. He knew his friend was a seer, and he thought he would have a good joke with it. So Kirk made sure to interview all the witnesses in that case.
Yeah.
And he took that as a form of, we'll call it logical proof, because maybe scientific proof stretches it a little too far. And he talked about the culture of the fairies that he learned from people with the second sight who had long conversations with them. And he said that they are said to have aristocratical rulers and laws, but no discernible religion, love, or devotion toward God, the blessed maker of all. They disappear whenever they hear his name invoked or the name of Jesus. And we've heard this said in abduction cases, right?
Yeah.
People call on the name of God, and whatever it is disappears.
Right. And it's just fascinating, coming from a Anglican minister. So I assume that gave him a little bit more credit at the time too.
Yeah, he weaves a lot of Bible verses into this. I'm skipping over a lot. For Kirk, he goes out of his way to point to the verses in the Bible that he thinks were talking about fairies or something in between God and man and angels.
Right.
And he talked about how the men in the fairy kingdoms would travel abroad, and they were either looking ahead at things or mimicking things or previewing tragedy, like omens of some sort. But yet they had rituals and services and community of their own. They were described as being tribal, which I think when we get to the jinn, that will also come up too.
Right.
He said their apparel and speech was similar to the country in which they lived. He said their houses were quite large, but of course you couldn't see them unless you were invited and earnestly required. He said these companions make themselves known and familiar to men. Otherwise, being in a different state and element, they neither can nor will easily converse with them. So they're normally just not ever talking to us, and we normally don't see them.
Right.
People who claim to see them today say that they often take the form of a point of light or like heat lines, like you would see coming off the asphalt on a hot day.
Right.
And Kirk interchangeably refers to them as fairies or subterraneans. And he said the subterraneans have controversies, doubts, disputes, feuds, and siding of parties, there being some ignorance in all creatures and the vastest created intelligences, not encompassing all things. He's a very good writer. But what he's saying is that they have fights. They don't always agree. And he also says that their vices and sins are usually different than ours, that they typically don't have earthly vices because they don't have earthly bodies. So their motives are less clear.
Yeah, it's like he's taken an early cultural anthropology approach to it.
That's exactly what he did. I mean, this is one of the first ethnographies in the area. It's really great.
Right.
And Kirk's work is so unique because he focused on witnesses and what they were saying, and then recorded and reported on that. Whereas other works at the time, there was famous mythological works, which went about cataloging all the different mythologies that these people had before they went away. And those are very important, too, to religion and folklore, and for us to even understand what people were thinking at the time. But this is the only work that went ahead and did that. It proved that the UAP phenomenon isn't modern. It's a refracted continuity. Kirk's secret Commonwealth isn't quaint, it's forensic. It provides metaphysical and behavioral descriptions of the same intelligence we now call NHI. And what changed was our framing, not the event structure. I have to remind us all of the definition that we all came up with for UAP, which I have yet to hear disputed, which is they are adaptive expressions of an unknown intelligence. So by our definition, this fits just fine. We have no trouble fitting fairies right into our definition of UAP, right?
Right. So, the true Fortean interpretation of UAPs requires historical continuity. So we got Kirk, now we got Keel, and RamX. They're not outliers, And like you said earlier, I liked the quote, we map the surface of the earth, but not the subsurface of perception. So they're all basically cartographers, each mapped the terrain with the tools of their time. And, the pattern didn't start with Roswell, basically. It started where humans first perceived the edge of the real or questioned it.
Totally. The secret Commonwealth and us together, we provide some sort of Rosetta Stone. Kirk, Keel, Valet, the whole lineage. It's a Rosetta Stone of high strangeness. And it all looks alike. One gives myth, and the other gives metadata. Together we reveal the intelligence in the pattern, not just behind it. There's an intelligence behind the way it stays concealed.
For sure.
And this study of fairies and our next study of jinn gets us that much closer to figuring all that out.
Yeah, it's really interesting how, these ideas still live in our culture today. It's just they've been almost, I guess they've been monetized in a way and have turned cartoonish, but they're still there. It's really fascinating to read an account that goes so far back.
Yeah, we go through how fairies end up getting involved in our modern depiction of angels in some of our videos on YouTube I'll link to. But basically, angels in the Bible are nothing like what you would see in artwork. And the artwork came from fairies. So eventually, people started mimicking the artwork of fairies with angels And then
Yeah.
that became people's perception of angels, that they had wings and golden hair, and
Yeah.
it's not at all what they look like in the Bible. So fairies end up getting involved in a lot of our perceptions.
Yeah, that's really cool. That, I think that's a great ending point. I mean, that's where we are. That's how it ties together.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the next one where we tie this into the jinn.
Yeah, for sure. So we did it. We did the fairy episode, Ram.
Yeah, we
feel about
finally
it?
got to it. And I'm like dying to tell you about some of the things that I found in Corruption Land, but I'm not going to. They can wait. And we're going to talk about fairies and jinn for the holidays.
Right on. Well, we'll stop there and look forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone, for listening. And thanks, Ram.
Thanks, Bones. Looking forward to the next one. Take care, y'all.